We know that
Say that again.
our topic this morning with Dan Stormont is green stormwater infrastructure. This is a very important topic because our streets serve as our main stormwater conveyance system. And flooding is a regular occasion when it rains hard and fast, and it seems to be doing that more and more these days. There's a lot of water that can be used for something besides going down the streets. Dan has worked for years as a computer engineer in both the public and private sectors. Currently, he helps with the development of the next generation of computer scientists and engineers by bringing quality computer science education to high schools. This is through a program called TEALS, T-E-A-L-S. It's a Microsoft philanthropies program. TEALS stands for Technology Education and Literacy in Schools. Dan is the Arizona Regional Manager. TEALS connects classroom teachers with tech industry volunteers through remote and in-classroom learning, and they're creating sustainable computer instruction technology education programs. In addition, Dan has worked through Watershed Management Group and Sustainable Tucson to serve our community in a number of ways, focusing on technologies for improving the sustainability of our lifestyles, whether ensuring water, food, and energy security, promoting alternative modes of transportation, or working to make local government more responsive to its citizens. Dan walks the talk of mindful living. He gets around town on bus, bike, and foot. His knowledge of infrastructure includes not only stormwater capture and management, but also the construction of nonprofit organizations. And Sustainable Tucson has a great debt of gratitude to Dan for helping us get established as a nonprofit. So I'm going to make Dan a co-host so he can share his screen. And Dan, we are very grateful you're taking some time this morning.
Oh, well, thank you for taking the time to invite me. I didn't know you were going to do the bio. I probably would have updated it for you just so you had something a little newer, but I am actually, as of Friday, I'm not the Arizona Regional Manager anymore. I'm now the Tools and Analytics Program Specialist for the TEALS program. So I changed roles, play with data more, something I enjoy doing. But okay, I see I'm a co-host, so let me share my slides really quickly. There we go. And let me make sure we get the right thing because you don't need to see the Zoom screen. All right, so you should be seeing the slides right now. Okay. And sorry, I can't. I'm in the middle. Hold on one second. I'm getting a question here. So.
Okay. We're all right. We're glad to be here.
Okay. Well, yeah, it is a pleasure to speak with you today. I apologize for dual tasking here. Oh, I really hate it when Zoom hides everything on your desktop with its little sidebars and everything. I'm just trying to get to. And actually, Stuart, I'm going to ask you. Jana would like to join this morning. Could you send her the link for the link? Just to Jana Siegel at AOL.com. That'll make it much easier than me trying to find that. So we can just jump in here.
You bet.
All right. Okay, so hopefully we're back to seeing the slides. So yes, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about green infrastructure, or you'll also hear it called Green Stormwater Infrastructure. It has the acronym of GSI, and sometimes you'll even hear low impact development. So there are a lot of different terms that relate with some very similar things. Green infrastructure is a term that's been used quite a bit. However, one of the reasons that they've moved more, if you notice, if you look at the city's webpage, or if you see the bill on your Tucson water bill, there's a charge for green stormwater infrastructure. The reason they've moved a little bit more towards the green stormwater infrastructure, and a lot of the discussion about this is that green infrastructure is used by landscapers to describe just about anything associated with, planting or growing green things. Whereas green stormwater infrastructure is a little bit more specific. It's kind of the process that you see in this image here. You see this one image from Watershed Management Group of a project that's collecting water off of the street, that's stormwater that Stuart was talking about, and using it to water native plants and trees. So you're converting this vision on the left. This is actually the same block in this case. So you have this image on the left, and this is the Tucson Board of Realtors, in case you're wondering, where you just had what you see a lot of around Tucson, where you see just this strip of gravel, nothing growing on it. It gets really hot and dry. The soil is dead. It's just dirt, and it's not a very attractive thing to see, and it's not a very cool place to walk or to bike by. And by just putting in some curb cuts and doing some other things to bring that water in off the street when it rains, that can support the trees that are planted along that right of way. And so this is one of the things that's critical also to Mayor Romero's Million Trees initiative, which I'll mention a little later on as well. But that's one of the things that I don't know if anybody caught the celebration. There was the 1-year anniversary celebration that Local First Arizona and the city of Tucson and the YWCA hosted just this past week about celebrating the 1 year since the city declared a climate emergency. And they were just talking about some of the things that were happening after that year had gone by. And that was one of the things that Mayor Romero mentioned, actually, was green stormwater infrastructure is a critical component in meeting the Million Trees initiative's goals, because there has to be a way to water these trees. And of course, we don't want to end up using Colorado River water to do that, because we don't, as I'm sure you're all aware, we're losing some of that Colorado River water. Actually already have lost some. That's that first level of shortage has gone into effect. And so we have less water coming to us from the Colorado River, and we can't really rely on Colorado River water. It is not, I know Tucson Water sometimes likes to call that a renewable resource, and theoretically it is. If we get heavy snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas or along the Rocky Mountains, then, we're going to get that water coming back to the Colorado, but you certainly can't count on that as being something that's going to happen in this time of climate change. And so those are sort of the backgrounds of green infrastructure, but you will hear these terms used somewhat interchangeably. So you'll hear green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, and also low impact development is this idea that when you're doing new development in an area, you want to maintain as much of the natural foliage that's in the area. You want to try to not disrupt the environment. If it's close to a river, for example, you don't want to disrupt the riparian environment too much. So you'll hear low impact development used sometimes as well. And that just means trying to preserve green spaces as you're doing development. Okay, so here is a definition from the US EPA. They have a guide called Green Infrastructure in Arid and Semi-Arid Climates. It's fairly decent. It actually picked a lot of things that a lot of the material in that guide has come from various groups working in especially the Southwest on being able to live in harmony with nature in this area and how to try to maintain our natural climate, our natural environment here in this area. And so it just uses this definition. I thought it was a good one, but it's certainly, as I mentioned, not the only one. Green infrastructure refers to a set of practices that mimic natural processes to retain and use stormwater. By promoting infiltration, evapotranspiration, and harvesting throughout the landscape, green infrastructure preserves and restores the natural water balance. So there are a few words in there that are kind of important. Infiltration, of course, is that idea of bringing the water off of hardscape into an area where it can sink down into the soil and help to support this landscape that we're growing there. Evapotranspiration, of course, is the process that trees and plants use to take up that water and also breathe. So that's the evapotranspiration thing. So actually trees, of course, do take in water. They also release some water vapor in the process of evapotranspiration. So some of that water that you're collecting does go back up into the air, just in the process of the daily life of all the green stuff that you put along there. And it's not a bad thing to have evapotranspiration. That, of course, helps to keep the air a little bit more humid. It also can have more of a cooling effect, that evapotranspiration. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that not all of the water is sinking into the ground. Some of it is going into those plants and trees and then being released back into the atmosphere. And of course, the harvesting is the physical process of bringing that water to an area where it can infiltrate and where it can water the trees and plants. And this picture on the right-hand side, you actually may, if you know anyone from Watershed Management Group, you may recognize that the middle of the three people in that picture is Lisa Shipek, the executive director at Watershed Management Group. And this is a picture of a walkway in the Dunbar Spring neighborhood. That's where Brad Lancaster lives. And Brad, of course, is considered to be the guru of rainwater harvesting, especially for the Southwest. And he's written a number of really excellent books on it. So if you want to dive deep into rainwater harvesting and understanding some of these processes like green infrastructure and how to create this kind of an environment, that those books that he's written are really excellent, especially the first volume, which talks about all the various ways to collect water. Okay, and now I'm going to do just a short video. This is only a 2-minute video, and it kind of talks about a large-scale green infrastructure project. This one is looking at some of the city's projects to try to restore riparian environments along the riverways. So hopefully this is going to work. Let me know if you don't have sound, because I don't remember if I checked the box when I started the slide, so I may not have audio.
No sound, Dan, sorry.
I was afraid of that. Let me stop the share for a second and fix that. That frustrates me with Zoom, that that's not a super obvious thing, that where the share is. Oh, and of course, I'm gonna have to go back. And de-minimize my slides. And then I'll come back and share that again. My apologies for kind of rushing doing this. There we go. Click the little share sound. Now we're good. You really would think that should be the default. I don't know when you would, have a video in a presentation that you don't want to hear the sound for. But anyway, have to ask Zoom, I guess. Let's see if this worked now.
Hey, good morning. As part of the tour in place here with Watershed Management Group, I am in one of the biggest water harvesting green infrastructure here in Tucson, which is the Kino Sport Complex. Look at all that. All that is rainwater harvesting. So it just depends on the scale that you want to work with. It can be on a little yard, or it can be in a huge city-wide infrastructure. So it's very interesting to see. This is a gray infrastructure. You just see gray, you just see concrete, cement. We're working to increase the green infrastructure. There is place for both. I mean, this takes the water away really, really quick. But green infrastructure, what we're trying to do is infiltrate that water and create additional urban wildlife habitat. So here we are on the origins of the Heritage Project that started with Tucson Water and Partners last year in June. And look at that. That's where the water comes out. The controls are here in my back. So this is what pouring water into the Santa Cruz River. Imagine having a flow of the Santa Cruz River all year around. So this is part of an effort to bring our flows, our rivers back here in Tucson and in the Sonoran Desert. This is where Father Kino used to ride his horse from San Javier Mission all the way to San Agustin, and this was the Mesquite Bosque area. It was covered with shade, it was covered with mesquites. Imagine that once again, to bring back portions of the Mesquite Bosque here to Tucson.
So that's kind of a fun little video. Let me get past it again. It always wants to play again. And there are a couple of terms that were brought up there that you may have keyed on. For example, there was the gray infrastructure and the green infrastructure. And of course, the gray infrastructure is what we're used to seeing with a lot of the washes and riverbeds in Tucson. It's this channelized, covered with concrete, or in some cases, earthcrete banks, that the idea is just to move the water really quickly. And of course, we got those ideas because that's what they did elsewhere in the Southwest. For example, I grew up in the LA area, and of course, the LA River is very famous from movies. It's where they're always racing cars, or the Terminator is chasing someone on a motorcycle. It's purely concrete. It's the bottom of it's concrete, the sides are concrete. It's just a big concrete channel. And that's what happened to a lot of the rivers. And of course, that's really not a natural state for rivers, and they're not serving the function that they should be serving. In the past, the reason that there have been, depending on who you ask, between 4,000 and 6,000 years of habitation here in Tucson is because of the river, the Santa Cruz River. And that was a healthy river. It was a river that people could farm from. It was a river that, as Joaquin mentioned in that video, was a river that supported a great mesquite bosque. That mesquite bosque was something that was remarked upon when travelers came here back at the turn of the century. They would say it was just this huge area, this oasis of trees in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. And of course, that's gone. Those trees are gone. Some of them were used for construction or firewood, but most of them just died because we drew down the water level in of our water table by pumping too much water. And also the river became more channelized, both through efforts to create these concrete line channels, and also as a result of some diversions of the water and some really bad projects. Like, for example, Sam Hughes he dug a diversion channel to pull some water to another area of town, and the diversion channel failed, and it actually ended up cutting a huge channel that forever damaged that stretch of the Santa Cruz near downtown. So, there have been a lot of mistakes and a lot of things that were not wise decisions that we made. And that's one of the things we're trying to restore, is to go from that gray infrastructure, all of that concrete, back to a green infrastructure. And interestingly, in the LA area, they're doing that now too. There are actually projects to restore the LA River. And I know the last time that I flew over LA, I was actually interested to see that there were some significant green stretches along what used to be all concrete. Now, there's still a lot of it that's concrete, but they are trying to recover some of that river a stretch at a time. So that's a really exciting thing in LA that they're doing. And, so you may have noticed, for example, I mentioned, if you are a Tucson Water customer, you probably have seen the Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program bill or charge on your bill when you get it monthly, if you've looked at that. It's a couple of bucks every month that Tucson Water customers are paying. And the reason they're doing that, of course, is to be able to support not only the installation of this green stormwater infrastructure in Tucson, but also the ongoing maintenance of it, which is one of the problems with these GSI projects. Is a lot of times people get really enthusiastic. You might get some neighbors together, they'll cut some curbs and start digging some basins and plant some trees and be like, oh, this is great. And then nobody maintains it, and it ends up getting clogged up, and you collect trash in there, and it gets overgrown with undesirable weeds. It maybe gets a buffalo grass infestation or something like that. And it's something that becomes more of an eyesore than something that is providing beauty to the neighborhood. And so the city realized that not only do they need the money to install this infrastructure, but they also need to pay to maintain it. And hopefully they'll train the people that they hire to maintain it to do that properly, because there have been problems with that as well. If you're familiar with some of the green infrastructure programs that are around town, like for example, at the Ward 3 office, there was a rain garden that had been put in by Watershed Management Group and maintained by the Monsoon Squad at Watershed Management Group for a number of years. I mean, this was a very mature rain garden, probably about, I believe at this point, it's about 5 years old. And there was a very great outcry because a city crew came in not realizing what it was, and they basically just stripped it bare down to nothing but dirt and some gravel. And so that upset a lot of people because, they shouldn't have, they basically destroyed this year's worth of growth and care that had been put into this rain garden. And, their excuse, of course, was, well, we've never been trained to do that. We were always told that those things, those little scrubby things down on the ground, those are weeds, they need to come out. So that's something that needs to happen. And that's something that actually we've been talking with the city at Watershed Management Group is about, how do they maintain this green infrastructure? Because there's definitely a training problem. It's not consistent throughout the city. And so hopefully with this, the funds that they're putting into maintenance of this infrastructure, they're going to be able to also train landscapers how to do that properly. And of course, one problem is that there's not one set of landscapers that does this. There are several different agencies within the city that maintain green spaces, and they usually contract with other landscapers, and that's a big part of the problem. But the reason you want to do that, I mean, these are some of the benefits of green infrastructure. It, of course, improves air quality. Trees do, in that whole evapotranspiration process, they do pull pollution out of the air, and they actually process that carbon. It helps them to grow. So that's the one time it's kind of an upside of that air pollution. Not that I'm saying that we should be polluting the air to feed trees, but they can process that. So that is one thing that trees can do well. It, of course, also shades and cools. Having a tree canopy helps to provide shade on the sidewalk. It provides some shade on the asphalt. The trees that shade the streets help to keep the streets from heating up so much. And when those streets get so hot at night, of course, they release that heat again. And so you get this situation where it's really hot during the day and it doesn't cool off a lot at night. And so that's another good reason for having this tree cover along the streets. And of course, it promotes recreation and mobility because it is much more enjoyable to walk around a neighborhood that has this green canopy than it is to walk down Speedway Boulevard, for example. Every time that I walk down Speedway, I'm thinking, why is it, you can look, there are trees in the median. So the cars that are in the fast lane of Speedway, they're getting shade. But when I'm walking down the street, there's no shade to be had. There's nothing but, like an asphalt parking lot on one side, if I'm lucky, a sidewalk, and then some asphalt and then street. So it's like, why aren't there any trees here? This would be much easier in the middle of a hot summer day if there was some shade here to keep me cool instead of having to walk here. And you see the same thing, you go to a bus stop, and there's no cover over the bus stop. There's no tree. If you're going to wait for a bus for anywhere up to 30 minutes, then you're sitting out in the sun because there's nowhere to get any shade. There's no way to protect yourself. So that is a really important thing. That's one of the things that is a benefit. And of course, as you're probably aware, especially in Tucson, like anywhere else, there was a study that was done just recently, and I wish I had the link to that. I should find that and send that to you, Stuart, so you can share that. There was a study that was done that did correlate green cover in a city with the economic viability or the economic health of that part of the city. And not surprisingly, the lower income parts of the city have less green canopy. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, is that usually the more affluent areas of a city are the ones that have more businesses, and they have the more expensive homes that have the landscaping. But it also is just a long-term issue of a climate justice and economic justice issue, where those parts of town have just not received that kind of support to maintain that infrastructure. And so, it's a problem where it is kind of self-perpetuating, and you can draw a direct correlation. I'll show you a map in a little bit that shows the green cover for Tucson. And if you overlay that map with the average income map, which you can find through Map Tucson, it's an exact match. All the bare patches are also the lower income areas in Tucson. So, it does very much as a pattern I had noticed years ago. It's really obvious that, for example, areas of the south side are purely, almost completely bare, and areas up in the area around the university, for example, is rather green. The more affluent neighborhoods around downtown are more green. So, it does definitely correlate between those. The other thing, of course, is you're irrigating the trees and plants. So that's how you get that shading and cooling. It also can help extend the pavement. I know right now, especially after we've had these monsoons that have been so blessed, but also have caused a lot of water to move through the streets. You probably have seen some giant size potholes. I've seen some potholes bigger in my neighborhood than I've ever seen before. And so, part of that is just having all that water moving on the streets. So that's another benefit of the Green Stormwater Infrastructure, is it can actually help the street pavement to last longer because it reduces that volume of water that's scrubbing the street as you get these large storms. And it reduces flooding. And there have been a number of studies and pilot programs that have shown how that works when you're pulling that water in and infiltrating it off the street. Of course, there's less to go farther down. And especially if you can do it in multiple locations, so that you don't get a chance for that flow to really build to a large enough flow that it can't be diverted, then you can reduce flooding in areas all along that. And as many of you may be aware, or you may not be aware, in the city of Tucson, we have actually designed our streets as part of the flood control program. So if you look at the Pima County flood control map, you'll notice that streets like Swan, for example, are a river. They're classified as a river on the map. They are intended to move a high volume of water along that street and dump it into the Rito. And so, we really don't want our streets to be rivers. It would be kind of nice to have that water going somewhere else other than down the street and flooding that street during a heavy storm, which you are quite aware of if you've driven any of the large arteries that are actually considered large flood control rivers for those purposes, that they do fill up with water very quickly. And of course, you also get the stormwater pollutants that are filtered by the trees. And we've seen that over by the Living Lab Watershed Management Group, that you can get these pollutants. For example, if you're not familiar with where the Living Lab is for Watershed, it's on Dodge, just north of Speedway. And the high point in that area, the high point where the Living Lab is the Discount Tire at Speedway and Dodge. So there's always rubber and oil and all these hydrocarbons that are in that lot out in front of Discount Tire. And when it rains, of course, all that stuff gets picked up and it washes across the street and straight into the street side basins for the Living Lab. But the kind of cool thing about that, and again, I'm not promoting the idea that we should have all this hydrocarbon pollution, because we really need to avoid all this hydrocarbon pollution. But the cool thing about it is that we have trees along that area, right along the edge of the street in Dodge, that are picking up all of that water that's washing in there. And the hydrocarbons actually make them thrive. There's an ironwood that is right at the corner of the Living Lab that's just huge. That ironwood is only about 5 years old, and yet it's gigantic because it's been processing all these hydrocarbons coming from Discount Tire and converting them into ironwood. So, that's something that they can do. Trees are very good at filtering contaminants and at processing carbons and turning them into growth. And I see there are a few comments in the chat. Stuart, is there anything you want me to address now before I keep moving on?
Sure, Dan.
I can't see the chat.
I'll just do a quick time check. Looks like we're doing really great. It's 10 o'clock and we'll go till 10:45. So
Yep.
We're in a good roll. Nancy Orr just asked, how many local developers do you know use low impact development guidelines?
There are some that actually are in the code now, and that's something that the city is working on. They are, of course, right now working on a plan to require construction to have that. There is a requirement within the county for residential construction to capture some percentage. It's not a huge number. I think it's less than 10% of rainfall on property. So there is a requirement in the guidelines for permitting that require that. For commercial construction, it's a little higher. It's I believe it's 25% off the top of my head, but don't quote me on that because I may have those numbers slightly off. So there are some requirements. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily well enforced, and it doesn't mean that it's really as much as it should be. I'm not aware of any developers offhand who are specifically focused on low impact development, but that again is something where the city is working on guidelines to actually, as part of the permit process, require that rainwater harvesting and that development of green infrastructure. Because as you've noticed right now, if you've gone down to the southeast, for example, that whole area around Vail, you've seen all the construction there, and they certainly aren't trying to maintain any of the native habitat there. You see the new construction, they'll just blade this huge area and then just throw down a bunch of cookie cutter homes. So it's certainly not happening there. And unfortunately, I've seen that with a lot of other developments too, that you're really not seeing that maintenance of that desert environment when they're planning it. And then when they do put in some landscaping, it's usually something that's totally inappropriate, like, a bunch of lawns and ash trees or something like that, something that really doesn't belong here. So that's definitely an issue. I mean, there are some developments, of course, that have, like Savano neighborhood, of course, has done work on trying to make sure that their neighborhood has a low impact development and green infrastructure. But I'm not aware widespread of developers that are doing that, or of new developments that are really taking that into account the way that they really should.
Well, that's a really important issue. And Nancy follows up wondering, I'm going to take a couple of things on. One, about city incentives for these developers. Would that be a good policy decision? And then Janice pointed out that there are trees now being planted in underserved neighborhoods like South Tucson.
Yep.
But of course, they need to have green infrastructure and catchment basins put in to water those trees. What might we as ambassadors do to encourage the city in terms of policies like that, in terms of consistent training? I think Jan also mentioned that earlier, consistent training for landscape people, and then what Nancy just brought up, some kind of incentives for developers.
Well, I would definitely talk, and I don't know if it's so much incentives, because again, that's going to end up being tax funded, whereas the city gives these developers permissions to develop an area, and same thing in the county. So like the problem with Vail, of course, is it's unincorporated Pima County, and so there's it's kind of the Wild West out there, and it's really not as easy to enforce some of these things, although Pima County does also have requirements on the book for development. I would really suggest that as ambassadors, something that's really important is to, first of all, get involved in some of the public meetings. So for example, Jana does go, one of the reasons she wanted to be here is she goes to the low impact development meetings. There is a committee that works on low impact development for the city of Tucson. They unfortunately haven't met very consistently recently, but I'm hoping that that's going to change, because it is a very important thing. There's also, of course, some planning going on at the city level to do more work on the green infrastructure and green stormwater infrastructure as part of other initiatives like the Million Trees Initiative. So there is work going on. So definitely find out what's going on as far as meetings that the city of Tucson are having or that the county board of supervisors are having, and make your voice heard. I mean, that's something that's the most important thing you can do, is advocate for these kind of practices to go into the building code. I mean, they have that power. The city and the county both tell developers what they can and can't do when they're developing a parcel of land. And so, you know, we can, rather than incentivizing them and giving these developers more money to do it, we can say, you know, okay, if you're going to build this development, you need to maintain X amount of the natural landscape when you do it. You know, you need to collect this much rainwater. You need to have, you know, this much shade canopy along your streets. You know, it's something they can do. They don't do it because it's cheaper not to. But, you know, it's one of those things that I don't really, my heart doesn't bleed much for developers because they're generally making a killing with these things. So, you know, they'll cry, oh, we can't afford to do it. You know, there's a shortage of housing. We can't possibly develop if you put all these restrictions on us. But we know it's not true. There's never been a time where they've changed zoning requirements and developers haven't figured out a way to go ahead and develop the property anyway. So, I mean, I would definitely push for that kind of thing.
Dan, are you saying the LID committee would be one good group? Are there other committees that we want to have on our radar so we know where to put our attention and what meetings to attend?
Yeah, well, and I think some of you are, I believe there's some members of Sustainable Tucson that are already involved in some of these. Are, of course, there's the mayor's climate committee. You know, there are a number of, Robert Bulacek is on there, Vanessa Gallego is on there. I mean, I know a number of people that are on that committee, and they have public meetings. Most of these committee meetings have an opportunity for you to at least observe, and a lot of times they have a period set aside, just like with a city council meeting, for public input. So if you have something that you would like to bring up, you have that opportunity to do that. And if nothing else, you can see what's going on and then talk to the members individually. And of course, you know, take the time to find out what's on the agenda. And I know this isn't easy. This is actually an issue that has bothered me for a number of years now, is, you know, it's hard to know what's on the city council's agenda before the meetings happen, because they don't have to post it. You know, the law, I believe it's state law, only requires them to post the agenda for their meeting 72 hours before the meeting. So usually that's when you find out what's going to be on the docket for the city council meeting that month. But I would say it's really important to just keep an eye on what's coming up and to make your voice heard, because all of those have an opportunity for public input.
Thank you. We should let you keep going.
Yep.
Well, I wanted to say something about that. That if you're going to go to the city council meetings or the other meetings in town, that you really listen first, you know, and learn as much as you can. So that, you know, you don't go in there thinking, oh, I know this one cool thing about green infrastructure, and, you know, act like a know-it-all and not really know it all, not know what's already being done by that group of people. So you need to do your homework. You need to sit and listen for a while. Like when I go to the green infrastructure, I'm there learning more than I'm representing, but I have had the opportunity to speak out. For instance, Dan noticed, once you learn this stuff, you see it all over town. You see the issues with the green infrastructure. And one of the things was on Grant that the bike path is right next to the cars. And then there's green infrastructure, you know, on the sidewalk side. And they could have put they could have divided the bikes up from the street by putting the green infrastructure between, you know, the bike path and the car. And I mentioned that because I knew enough about what was going on to mention that. But most of the time I'm there to listen and to learn, and I keep learning. I go to every water event that there is to really know, so that I don't put my foot in my mouth, because I'm representing Sustainable Tucson. Also, Dan, what is the name of that, the people that get all the money to put in, like the water for, that they were going to put in hotels and a museum and everything related to the Santa Cruz River?
But you're thinking Rio Nuevo.
Yeah. we need somebody to go to those meetings and to represent sustainable, because I went to one of those meetings and they never heard of any of this sustainability stuff, and they were just putting in a hotel that wouldn't have, any, sustainability features. So we need somebody to go to those meetings, but there's lots of meetings in town.
It's hard to keep track of them all, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you for those actions, and thank you also for helping fill our list out here. This is very helpful.
Yep. And actually, I think you mentioned Grant. That's actually Glenn that has a terrible example of green infrastructure. So there are some bad examples in town. I could point out some other ones as well. So that's another thing to be aware of. There's good green infrastructure and bad green infrastructure, and Glenn definitely is not a good example.
That's actually how I got into going to the green infrastructure meetings, was that I had sent a letter saying, talking about some bad green infrastructure on Stone by the Public Works Center. They were even putting, what do they call it, herbicides in their green infrastructure, and the trees were falling over because they were put in the deepest part of the basin, which was making root rot. So it was a horrible example. So I actually contacted Marie Light, and she asked me to be on the green infrastructure team.
Yep. Okay.
Nice.
So it's all about making those connections and finding out who's doing these things. All right. So I mentioned that green stormwater infrastructure can reduce flooding. And this was a study that was done in 2015. This was a study between Tucson Water and Watershed Management Group, and they also were working with Pima County Regional Flood Control District. It's one of those weird things when we're talking about stormwater. There's multiple parties interested, and there's also different ownership for different parts of it. So for example, if you're riding on the loop up by the Rito River, as I was doing after a recent storm, you probably have noticed that they've had the caterpillars out there blading again, which drives me crazy because, when they blade it, they of course destroy all of this green infrastructure that's grown up. They've got all this nice riparian environment. Some of them aren't nice. There are some invasive species you get in there too, but they just blade it and make it look like it's concrete again. I mean, it's actually sand at the bottom, but it's the same difference. And that's the county doing that. And in their defense, they don't have much choice because FEMA requires that, because of our rather retrograde laws about flood control. They have to blade because they have to be able to handle a 100-year flood event. And so anytime that you get too much greenery and too much silt built up in the bottom of one of those rivers, they come out with the tractors and start to blade them. Thankfully, they aren't blading the entire width of the channel anymore. That's one thing they have learned. They're only blading part of it and allowing the other riparian growth to stay there so that it can help to spread back out to the area they just bladed. But it's like a nonstop thing. And we really, that's something that's maybe a little bigger than Sustainable Tucson, but it is something where we really need to get FEMA to change those laws. They shouldn't even be insuring homes that are built in a floodplain. And that's part of the problem is the National Flood Insurance Program does insure homes that are built right in the floodplain. And of course, they only pay to rebuild that house that just flooded out because it's built in the floodplain. So that's one of the reasons that FEMA requires that constant maintenance of what they're considering to be flood control structures. So that's one of those things that we need to address, is not having that. But this was a study down, there was a lot of flooding down in the airport wash area. Of course, airport wash area is one of those less affluent south side areas where there's not a lot of green infrastructure, and there was a lot of flooding happening. You can see in this map on the left, there's actually a whole series of maps in this study. I would encourage you to take a look at this if you're interested. It's actually in the library section of the Watershed Management Group webpage. If you want to read through the whole study, it's on there. And you can see these maps show the areas where installing green infrastructure reduced the flooding. And so, like, for example, you've got some green infrastructure was installed. The green infrastructure is sort of shown with the black bars in there. And then the green and the yellow show the reduction in flooding that occurred because they installed this green infrastructure. And in some cases, it may look a little strange because it's like the green infrastructure is not necessarily where the change in the flooding was, but that's because it's collecting it before it has a chance to run farther downhill and cause more trouble. So good report. I would definitely encourage you to check it out if you want some more details. But again, that shows that if you can just using green infrastructure alone without anything else, without any flood control structures, without any diversion channels or anything like that, you can reduce that flooding by 10 to 24% throughout this area that they studied. It also, of course, increases groundwater recharge. Most of the groundwater recharge in the Tucson Basin comes from the established river channels, especially, the Rito, not so much the Santa Cruz. The Santa Cruz is very deep because it's just the geology of the basin as well. But especially along, the Pantano, the Rito, the Tanque Verde, Sabino Creek, those are all areas that have fairly shallow groundwater. And there is actually a significant amount of water that does get recharged, which is part of the reason you, of course, don't want to shut off the flow to those completely. If you did perfect rainwater harvesting and no rainwater ever left anyone's home and the rest of that water, all got infiltrated along the street sides, you might worry, well, no water's ever going to get to the river. That, of course, isn't going to happen because you're still going to get that flow getting into the Rito as well, just because there's so many areas where that water is coming from and you couldn't possibly collect all that water. But that ability to infiltrate the water rather than rushing it out of town quickly is what gives you that ability to recharge water. And honestly, the natural structures for doing that, those riverbeds and the various areas that water does collect a lot of the water. If you look at the stream gauge measurements that the USGS has, there are a number of stream gauges within the Tucson Basin, and in a typical rain event, very little of that water actually doesn't end up sinking into the ground in Tucson. So that's one thing that is a good thing, but we need to improve that. And of course, we also would like to have the water where it's doing us some good rather than running all off and then going into some storm basins like the one you saw down by the Keno Sports Park. That is a nice environment in that it has a lot of reeds growing around it. It's got a lot of birds that gather there, a lot of waterfowl, but it is still just a big storm basin. And you also may have seen that if you've driven along the new section of Grant, that there are some rather large storm control structures there. At least they are making them to where they will infiltrate more water rather than just sitting there and evaporating. But it is still moving water away from watering trees along the road, for example, to just a large collection area where it infiltrates. And of course, there are social benefits as well. If you have the green infrastructure that encourages people to get outside, that's going to improve your health. You're going to get out, you're going to walk, you're going to bike, you're going to play outside. And so, that's a public health benefit, just being able to get outside. And of course, the cleaner air is also a bonus, and the lower temperatures. So all of these things can improve public health. They also help beautify neighborhoods. I mean, let's face it, I enjoy walking through a neighborhood that has a green canopy like Dunbar Spring much more than I do walking down Speedway Boulevard, for example, that has none of that. It can, if done right, it can help to calm traffic. Here you see there's a traffic circle. They actually put one of those in right near my house too recently as part of one of the programs I'm going to talk about in a minute. And so that can help to slow down the traffic, which is important, of course, to make the streets more safe in the neighborhood. And it can build community. If you're getting outside, if you're getting to know your neighbors, if it's comfortable to get outside, then there are more people on the streets. It can help reduce the crime rate. It can help you learn who lives in your neighborhood. It helps you make those connections. And so that's a really important benefit of having a greener neighborhood that you can enjoy. There are some economic benefits. This was a study that was done by Watershed Management Group. I forget who they were working with on that, but essentially, a rain garden, it does, in this case, they estimate about $500 for a rain garden, which is probably about right if you're doing, rock line basins, etc. It's probably running about $500 or to possibly as much as $1,000 for a larger scale rain garden. But it can capture 12,000 gallons of stormwater and then provide community benefits. And those community benefits, again, are, in the aesthetic benefits, also the health benefits, the cleaner air, again, which affects health. So, you can do a lot with a small amount of money. You do actually get this repayment of about $4 for every dollar you invest into green infrastructure. And that's something that's been shown in a number of studies, not just this particular little infographic I have from WMG. And so, of course, if you do that on a larger scale, if you do it on neighborhood scales or even a citywide scale, it's going to cost some money. It probably actually, if you look at the Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program, you'll see that they budgeted more than $250,000 for doing these street side basins, but it is still going to provide benefits in reduced need for stormwater infrastructure, collecting more water, which helps to make us more water secure. And of course, just having those community health and social benefits. The reduced crime, of course, is a big benefit. The health benefits are a big one. So they're all important things, and it does pay for itself. There are economic benefits as well. And so here's an example. I keep talking about these things, talking about basins and curb cuts. So this is an example of a right-of-way basin. That's usually what we're talking about when we're talking green stormwater infrastructure. There are some other things, the collection basins that are maybe the larger structures on a big street like Grant. But normally when you're talking green stormwater infrastructure, you're talking about right-of-way basins. And the reason that the city can do projects in the right-of-way basins, of course, is, as I'm sure hopefully most of you are aware, the right-of-way does not belong to you as a property owner. It is actually the property of the city. You have to maintain it, which is maybe not the best deal, but it also does mean that the city can put in public benefit things like right-of-way basins, this green stormwater infrastructure in the right-of-way, because it is something that is actually city property. If you look at a plat map from Map Tucson, for example, which is, I would recommend that if you're doing, any work on your property, to get the aerial view of your property from Map Tucson. And you'll see that it has the parcel borders on there. And you'll notice that those borders don't extend to the right-of-way because that's not actually part of your property. So you can do these neighborhood scale projects without having to get permission from each and every property owner because it's not actually their property. And you can do things like the curb cuts, like you see there. There's water coming in. You see the flow of the water down the street. The water is coming into a basin. You see that there is a little sediment trap there. That rocked area that runs into the basin helps to prevent erosion right along the street side and also captures some of the garbage that floats down the street. So, the bottles and the wrappers and the bags and, the McDonald's cartons or whatever, all of those things can be collected in this little sediment trap before the water goes up and over. It really should kind of show a little one rock check dam there at the end of that rocked sediment trap that to capture those things, and then it'll go up and over and into a basin. You also see the tree is at the far end of the basin at the high end. That's what Jana was talking about down by the County Public Service Center. There, if you ever want to go see a bad example of a right-of-way basin, those are terrible examples. They're flow-through basins. This is a flow-in basin. The overflow actually is not shown on here, but the overflow would be to normally another basin going down the right-of-way. They are flow-through basins on stone by the County Public Service Center, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you do have to plan for, if you're going to have a flow-through basin, you're going to get water that could build up some speed going through there. So you have to be careful where and how you plant things. And in that case, they put all those poor Palo Verde trees right at the deepest part of the basin where the water is pooling on top of their root balls. It's also scrubbing those basins at a rather high speed. So very bad design. This one, what would happen is when that basin fills up, normally it's going to fill up to the level of the curb cut and then the water just won't flow in anymore. But again, you should also have somewhere for overflow to go if you do overfill the basin. There are a number of plans, Stuart. I really appreciate that you sent out that reading guide. There are some great references. Some of the things I'm showing here are actually references in that guide, so you may have seen some of those links already. This is the City of Tucson and Pima County's Low Impact Development and Green Infrastructure Guidance Manual. As far as I know, this is still the one they're using. They may have been in the process of revising it recently, but when Pima County flood control and the City of Tucson are working together, this is their guidance that's currently in effect for developing that green infrastructure. And so you can see here some of the things that they have for the structural GI practices, like harvesting rainwater and stormwater and having conveyance features that are naturalized. So they wanted to look kind of like this picture here, where it looks like that feature is a part of that natural environment. It's not just, like some little concrete basin sitting out there collecting water. You also, of course, for the the low impact development, you want to try and preserve the natural flow path. You can never really succeed very well trying to tell a river or a stream where to go, because it's going to go where it wants to go. And so the best thing is just to work with nature and to try and preserve those natural flows and minimize the impervious area. So you want to have as much area to infiltrate that water as possible and have less soil compaction and disturbance. And unfortunately, that's what happens with a lot of development. And so the combined things, of course, the reason they do that is for flood control, stormwater management, pollution prevention, all the things we've talked about.
And we're closing in on 10:30. Would this be a good time to take a few more questions?
Sure. Yeah, I can speed up a little bit on because I think I'm almost to the end of this anyway. So
okay. First is one from Jessica. Is the best way to get a right-of-way installation to go through watershed management? And are there other ways that we neighbors can do such things?
Actually, as a neighborhood, especially if you have a neighborhood association, you can do what Dunbar Spring did. Dunbar Spring, it was a thing where, well, it was kind of interesting because Brad Lancaster went and started doing curb cuts before they were legal. They just went out in the middle of the night with, some concrete saws and some sledgehammers and just knocked a chunk of the curb out and then dug a basin. And, he pointed out the benefits of that to the city, and the city made that a legal process. Of course, yes, definitely Watershed Management Group can help you to install these projects. You will have to have funding for that, of course, because that would be something, especially at a neighborhood scale, it's something where you're either going to need some grant funding from the city, for example, or some neighborhood funding to do it. But honestly, it's something that if you do a little bit of studying, maybe ask for some experience from people who have done these projects in the past, you can do a right-of-way project with, a group of neighbors, some plants, some picks and shovels. And, it's the nice thing about earthworks is they're fairly easy to do on your own. I've done all of the basins at my home on my own. It's just, you get out there, you invest some sweat, you get it done. And, it's one of those things that it's fairly easy to do. You do need to make sure, do check with the city to make sure that there's no reason that you can't install that in your neighborhood. There are some things like utility right-of-ways you need to be aware of. Of course, always call Blue Stake to make sure that you're not digging where there's a gas line or a water line or a phone line. They get really upset when you break those things. So, and can be very dangerous too. So, there are things you need to keep in mind. Definitely Watershed Management Group is a resource. It's not going to be a free resource though for a neighborhood scales project. So I want to just make you aware of that. But there are funds available through the city for neighborhood scale projects.
Super. How about a question from Kim and then from Trace?
Sure.
Kim says, what do you see in the future for the Santa Cruz River? Will there be more water?
I hope so. I don't know. The pessimist in me says that we're not going to deal with our overuse of water. We still use too much water. We do the best of anywhere in Arizona. Let me point that out right now. We use at residential scale, we use about 81 gallons per person per day, which is 50% less than, or well, not 50%, it's about 25% less than our neighbors to the north, who use quite a bit more water. And it is actually one of the lowest water rate usages in the Southwest. New Mexico usually beats us out a little bit on that. And there are a couple areas in Southern California that are doing really well now too. But, it's still 81 gallons per person per day. But if you look at the number of people that that water has to support in Tucson, and you look at the possibility of losing all flows from the Colorado River, for example, which is mostly what we rely on right now for our water, then we really need to be about half that. I mean, to be sustainable, to be self-sustainable from just the water that falls from the sky, we need to be down to about 40 gallons per person per day. So there is a lot of work to be done. But if we could do that, if we could handle our overuse of water, and if we could be wise in the way that we're utilizing our water, I do hope we could restore the flow naturally to the Santa Cruz. Just remember that right now, the Santa Cruz, the water table is over 100 feet below the Santa Cruz. So it's going to take a lot of work to get that water table back up to the point where it can support a surface flow on the Santa Cruz. And when it comes to rivers, the surface flow, of course, is based on the groundwater level, because it's essentially just the water that's being pushed up from below and sitting on the surface. So you've got to build up that groundwater in order to be able to support that surface flow naturally. We can do artificial ones like the Heritage Project, which is a great use of that reused water, that recycled water is a great way to use that effluent, but it's not a natural flow. It rather rapidly sinks in because the groundwater table is well below the level of the river.
Can I say something here? I don't think I've heard you mention this, but Watershed Management Group has the River Run Network, and people who have homes that are near like a river, like the Santa Cruz, can help restore the watershed by doing, catchment basins, in their yards. So that's something to keep in mind if any of you guys have homes near rivers.
Yep. Of course, River Run Network applies to anyone in Tucson, but yeah, that is a good point about, the best targets for residential rainwater harvesting are those close to the Rito, for example, or close to Pantano. You had some other questions, Stuart? Because we only have about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Dan, do you know of any one watershed or anybody else who's attempted to figure out how much we could do in the way of green infrastructure and tree canopy?
Well, I know that the mayor is planning on the 1,000,000 trees, and she's been working with Tucson Clean and Beautiful and Watershed Management Group in the city of Tucson, but Tucson Water within the city of Tucson, to calculate how much water they would need, because most of that's planned to be green infrastructure being supported by rainwater. That's kind of, is our 1,000,000 trees enough? I know I've seen numbers like this map I'm showing right now. If you're actually going to get a good green cover for all of Tucson, you'd probably need about 5 million trees at least. So maybe 1,000,000 trees isn't enough. But there are some, I don't have any numbers right offhand. I know people have looked at, and of course, there are a lot of things that go into that. What kind of trees you're planting. A mesquite or a palo verde requires a lot less water than a desert willow, for example. So, you need to also determine what kinds of trees you're planting.
The reason I ask is that I've been trying to do those calculations, and as near as I can tell, 1,000,000 rainwater large mesquite trees could productively use about 5 billion gallons of water a year, but we've got about 25 billion gallons of potential harvestable water. So there's a real question is, what do we do with the other 80% that we couldn't use for green infrastructure?
Well, and a lot of that is, the desire is to infiltrate a lot of that so that we can build up the water table again. If we're not pumping and we're infiltrating, ADWR says that we have 50,000 acre feet per year of natural recharge. That came from the One Water meeting I was at last month, I believe it was. So, if you're infiltrating 50,000 acre feet per year, you could actually get healthy pretty quickly if you don't keep pumping it back out.
Well,
So
the issue that is a concern to me is that as far as I know, you don't get recharge from infiltration with green stormwater infrastructure. The groundwater is hundreds of feet, and you don't recharge from a 6-inch basin. So we've got to have other methods besides green infrastructure.
Well, green infrastructure is just one tool to keep you from having to use municipal water to water those trees, for example. So, they're all tools. That's green infrastructure for the most part, although there is infiltration that is actually recharging. So, and of course, it's also time scale. So, there's some small amount even from the central part of town. But I mean, you're correct. Like here in the central, where I live in the central part of Tucson, the water that I infiltrate into the basins at my home is not going to get down to the aquifer in any reasonable amount of time, and there'd be a very small amount, if any, that actually makes it that far. So, most of that is being used to support the growth that's around my house and to reduce that demand for municipal water, which again is reducing the demand for groundwater. And by reducing that groundwater demand, that allows the natural recharge to help to make up that loss that from what we've been taking out. We have a big deficit we're trying to make up, and it's going to take time to be able to make up that deficit. There are some numbers, and I kind of wish that Watershed actually just put out a newsletter recently where they were talking about hydrolocalism, which is their new phrase for being able to get by on just the water that we have here locally. And I know that there are calculations that have been done that show that we can get by without cap water, just using the infiltration rates that we have now of 50,000 acre feet per year. But it's how we manage water. That's what it all comes down to.
Yeah, I've looked at.
I'm going to jump in. I'm sorry, just I'm watching the clock.
Yeah, got 5 minutes.
You've talking with you is kind of like taking a walk through an illustrated encyclopedia hand in hand, and there's so many areas that you know about. Danya wants to take us back to a very localized question. She says I think she's just checking for understanding. She says, I've heard that I'm allowed to plant in the right of way in front of my house without permit, as long as I leave space for a walkway and don't dig where there are utilities. Is that a correct reading?
That is correct. If you do a curb cut, you need to get a permit from the city, and it costs about $75, I believe. And also, of course, you have to be aware of utilities. If you're fortunate, like at my house, all of my utilities come in from the back of the house, so I didn't have to worry about that in the right of way. You can plant. There are a few guidelines. For example, on the street side of the right of way, you need to allow a 12-inch margin. And that's just so people, if somebody parks there, they can step out of the car without falling into your basin. And also on the sidewalk side, you need to leave a 6-inch space just in case anybody, steps off of the sidewalk. If you don't have a sidewalk, you have to leave a walkway roughly as wide as a sidewalk would be. So those are the guidelines. There are some guidelines in the green infrastructure guidelines from the city that just show that layout. They show, how deep the basin can be and those margins of the 1 foot by the street and the 6 inches by the sidewalk that you need to allow.
That is so neat.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would suggest that, you guys really take a rebate class either from Siri or Watershed Management Group to really know how to do it in your yards and to do it correctly so you don't do some damage. And they'll go over things that are particular to your property.
Yep.
And while we're talking these details, Ann was wondering about, is there a program with Tucson Water for neighborhoods that want to do a green stormwater project?
There may be some more coming out. I know this is one of the things that the city is looking at right now. I'm not sure if the funding is still available. There have, in past years, there's been funding from the city for these kinds of projects in neighborhoods. You have to have a neighborhood association. So that's one critical thing. Not everybody does. We don't have one where I live, unfortunately. But you have to have a neighborhood association to apply for it. You have to show the city that if you install this neighborhood scale project, that there's going to be a maintenance plan for it. And if you do those things, you just apply through your ward office. And there's been money in the past years that has been sent out to all of the different wards to support these kind of projects. However, with the new Green Stormwater Infrastructure program, there's some question about whether that ward by ward approach is going to continue. So I would talk to your ward office about that and find out if they have any word about whether there's going to be some funding or not. There has been funding in the past, but there may not now, just because they're kind of diverting some of that money that went into those neighborhood projects to the Green Stormwater Infrastructure program through Tucson Water.
And I also, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I put a link to the city's page about the neighborhood level. I think they definitely have money for that.
I think I'd heard that they put the money on hold. So it's something I would ask the ward office, that they would have, your city council member is going to know whether they're going to have funds for next year or not. Okay, I should rush through because I see I got 2 minutes left and I do want to be respectful of your time. So this is something, take a look at this. This is a map. It's an interactive map from Pima Association of Governments. It shows down to, you can zoom in all the way down to like the block level, and it will show how much green cover there is for any part of the Tucson metropolitan area. And so you can see, not surprisingly, that there's green strips kind of along where the rivers are. Some of them that are green are because that's where there's been some effluent recharge, like down on the south side. You can also see some up kind of around where Sweetwater is. And then, you see some along the Rito, especially around the Tanque Verde and Sabino Creek confluence. So really interesting. You also notice that the really light colors, of course, are on the south side. And that's what I mentioned. If you take that map AZ map and you overlay it, the one in the map AZ is a map that shows the economic indicators for Tucson. You lay those two on top of each other and you'll see almost a perfect correlation between green and income level.
Wow.
Okay, so here's some of the current initiatives. I mentioned most of these as I'm going along. Of course, all of these things are documented in Plan Tucson, which is in the process of being revised right now. Prop 407 was approved, the Parks and Connections. In fact, that the traffic circle that I mentioned and some park improvements that happened near my house were funded by Prop 407. That is the green connections between parks. They're doing park renovations, and then they're also doing green infrastructure projects to connect those parks. The mayor's Tucson Million Trees project, the Green Stormwater Infrastructure Fund I mentioned, and then One Water is Tucson Water's plan that they are currently working on for the long range water security of Tucson. And they're looking at everything, including green infrastructure, rainwater harvesting, other sources of water. So, I mean, they're looking at every possible recycled water. I mean, they're looking at all these different sources of water as part of that One Water. That's why they call it One Waters. They're looking at all the water resources as one water source for Tucson. This is Plan Tucson. Good read if you want to. It is rather long, but in case you're not aware of it, Plan Tucson is a voter approved plan. Like I say, the last major revision was in 2013, so they're actually about due for another one. It usually comes out about every decade. So they are working on it right now. I don't know the progress of it. The one that's currently in effect is the 2013 version of Plan Tucson. And that is pretty much anything, whether it comes to development, transportation, economy, the cultural resources, and of course, anything to do with the environmental or any issues like that. Those are all covered in Plan Tucson. And anytime the city does a project, they are supposed to be able to refer back to the appropriate section of Plan Tucson to show how they're following that guidance. It is voter approved guidance that applies to any project that is done in the city of Tucson. There are, of course, other plans that also, like, the regional transportation plan is something that marries with Plan Tucson, but Plan Tucson for the city of Tucson is the plan that they follow for just about anything you can think of. So it's a good read. It's very thick, but I would suggest looking that up if you're not familiar with it. And here, for example, green infrastructure, there are policies in Plan Tucson that apply to that. And you can see how it's GI 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Prop 407, I mentioned that was voter approved. That's the parks and connections. So it is improvements to neighborhood parks, and then also improvements to connections to join those together. Tucson Million Trees, again, this is one place you can look at it. There's also now a city climate portal that you can find the Tucson Million Trees initiative on. I'll show you a picture of that. And actually, Stuart, I don't know if you were going to share these slides. They are, of course, in the shared drive for Sustainable Tucson. These do all have links on them as well. So you can click on the picture and it links to the webpage, because I'm not going to have time to look at those. But the pledge that Mayor Romero made was to plant 1 million trees in Tucson by 2030. Maybe not enough, but it is certainly a good step. The Green Stormwater.
Dan. Oh, you got one more? Go ahead.
I got just a couple. Let wrap through really quickly. Green Stormwater Infrastructure Fund, I mentioned that as well. You can find that the proposal is actually, the plan now was approved. So you can find the details on that from Tucson Water. Here's that one water plan I was talking about. That is the long range plan to replace the former plan, which was the 2000 to 2050 plan. They're generating a new one water plan that goes up to 2100. Couple of guides. This green infrastructure guides, you can download these for free, or you can purchase a hard copy of them from Watershed Management Group. Have a lot of details about how to do green infrastructure in there. I'm going to skip Lisa's talk, but it is a fun one if you get a chance to look at it sometime. And this was the other thing I wanted to mention, was the City of Tucson Climate Action Hub. I first became aware of this yesterday, or day before yesterday, when they had the anniversary of the climate emergency. So this is on the City of Tucson's webpage. You can see it's got the Tucson Million Trees link there. It's got the Green Stormwater Infrastructure link, Team Up to Clean Up, and Solar Tucson. All of those are on the Climate Action Hub. So that is a great place to go look to see what the city is planning and the current status of that. And we're done. Sorry, I did run a few minutes over, although we were taking some questions there, and I also fumbled around with the slides at the beginning. I apologize for that.
No worries, Dan. This has been really enjoyable, interesting. As I said, it's next best thing to actually getting out there on the streets with you. So I'd like to acknowledge also Jana, who I believe is the person who gave birth to the idea of the ambassadors of sustainability. Dan, Jana, Sharia, and I met to do some brainstorming about that, but I'd like to credit both Dan and Jana for their very important input on the creation of this program. And Dan, again, thank you for your work, the behind the scenes work to make Sustainable Tucson into a functional nonprofit organization.
Yep,
We're going to
my pleasure.
Oh, and before we go, Dan and Jana, you might be interested when Audrey will be giving her presentation in October on the native trees study that she did. So for a particular look at what kind of trees actually do we want to plant in these 1 million trees.
Great. Yeah, that
And
sounds awesome.
I'm going to suggest that people cut and paste the links in the chat, because there's a lot of good stuff there that you can look at if you haven't already clicked on those links to open those pages. And
or just save the chat.
And I want to talk about how important it is to have you ambassadors. And I want to thank you guys all for taking the time to do this kind of learning, because it's really getting to be important. Sustainable Tucson didn't have a representative when we had the climate emergency And so our name's not on that. And so we do need enough people to cover, the different city events and stuff like that. So I really do recommend that you all, take as much time as you can, to learn. And it's fun. It's fun to learn if whatever your interest is. Mine is water. So I represent, at the water events. So just like be lifelong learners and share that knowledge.
Thank you
Absolutely.
both. Yeah. We're going to take a 10-minute break. My clock says 10:51, so that means how about 11 o'clock? Let's get back sharp at 11 and we'll carry on with the next. And thank you again so much, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Stuart. Thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy your break.
Okay, we'll have a little music, this time from the class important skills. One of the most important skills in communication is to listen. And Trace, I'm actually going to ask you not to record this. This will be our own private conversation.